How did a brilliant officer, a decorated humanitarian aide, and the scion of a respected clerical family, a man who once stood as Norway's brightest, devolve into the world's most infamous traitor? This is the central haunting paradox of Vidkun, Quisling, a name that has transcended its Norwegian origins to become a universal abstract noun, a global synonym for the ultimate betrayal, the collaborator who sells his nation to a foreign invader, the citizen who dons the enemy's livery to rule over his own people. His journey was not a simple linear descent into villainy. It was a far more complex tapestry of profound ideological conviction, of staggering, almost pathological personal arrogance, of deep-seated psychological trauma born from witnessing unimaginable horrors, and of a messianic complex so powerful that it convinced him he, and he alone, was destined to save Norway, even if that salvation required its total destruction. To truly understand the man who would willingly align himself with the monstrous ideology of National Socialism, one must first understand the extraordinarily promising individual he was, the product of a privileged, intellectual, and deeply religious environment. Born in 1887 in the pastoral tranquility of Fyresdal, he was the son of John Lauritz Quisling, prominent pastor in the Church of Norway and a noted genealogist. This upbringing instilled in him a powerful, romanticized sense of history, a belief in Norwegian destiny, and a rigid moral framework, albeit one he would later warp to fit his own grandiose ambitions. He was a child prodigy, a precocious intellect, who excelled as a student, graduating from the Norwegian Military Academy in 1911 with the highest scores in its entire history, a record that stood for decades. He was commissioned as an officer in the general staff, and his early career was stellar, marked by intellectual rigor and administrative genius. He was the golden boy of the Norwegian military, a man seemingly destined for the highest echelons of leadership. Universally respected for his sharp, incisive mind and his profoundly serious, brooding, almost monastic demeanor. But beneath this polished exterior lay a restless intellect drawn to grand theories of history, philosophy, and the fate of civilizations, a mind that would soon be exposed to an experience so harrowing it would shatter his worldview and set him irrevocably on a fanatic's path. Before we embark on this dark and complex journey into the life of Vidkun Quisling, tracing his path from national hero to the ultimate traitor, we must take a moment to ask for your support. Our mission as a channel is to produce in-depth, thoroughly researched, and uncompromising historical documentaries. We strive to explore the pivotal figures and events that have shaped our world, particularly those uncomfortable, challenging, and morally ambiguous subjects that are often simplified or ignored. Creating this level of content requires a significant, sustained investment in research, writing, archival sourcing, and production, far beyond what many other channels attempt. If you find this exploration of history valuable, if you believe in the importance of understanding our past and all its complexity, hitting the like button is a small, simple action that makes a massive difference. It signals to the platform that this content is valued and helps our work reach a much wider audience of history enthusiasts. More importantly, if you have not already done so, please subscribe to our channel and make sure to ring that notification bell. By subscribing, you become a core part of our growing community and ensure that you will never miss a future episode, a future investigation into the annals of history. Finally, the greatest compliment you can possibly give us is to share this video with a friend, a family member, or in an online community that, shares an interest in military history, political intrigue, or the profound, often disturbing complexities of human nature. Every single like, every subscription, and every share directly fuels our ability to continue this work, allowing us to dig deeper, research more thoroughly, and bring these critical, complex stories to light for everyone. Your support is, without exaggeration, the lifeblood of this channel. The first and most critical turning point in Quisling's life, the crucible in which his fanaticism was forged, arrived not on a battlefield but amidst a humanitarian catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. In his capacity as a brilliant young military attaché, Quisling was assigned to Russia, and it was here his path intersected with another towering Norwegian figure, the celebrated Arctic explorer, scientist, and now famed humanitarian, Fridtjof Nansen. Armed with this apocalyptic Manichaean worldview, a stark vision of the world as a battleground between Nordic order and Bolshevik chaos, and a growing, profound sense of his own messianic importance, Quisling returned to Norway. After a brief and tumultuous stint as Minister of Defense in the early 1930s, where he became notorious for his paranoid anti-communist rhetoric and his use of military force against striking laborers, he made his decisive independent move. In 1933, the same year Hitler consolidated power in Germany, Vidkun, Quisling co-founded the Nationalsamling, or National Unity Party. This was to be his vehicle, his hand-picked instrument to save Norway from the perceived twin threats of a weak, corrupt parliamentary democracy and the ever-looming shadow of Soviet Bolshevism. The party was, from its inception, a complete and utter disaster. It was a poorly disguised imitation of German and Italian fascism, a bizarre hodgepodge of contradictory ideas. It blended corporate statism from Mussolini, anti-parliamentarian sentiments, romantic agrarianism, deeply anti-Semitic and Nordic racial theories, and, at its center, a fur principle focused on the infallible leadership of Quisling himself. He created a paramilitary wing called the Herden, who marched in uniforms and engaged in street brawls. Mimicking the German SA, he adopted the Sun Cross, an ancient Norse symbol, as his party's swastika. The Norwegian people, however, were thoroughly unimpressed. Norway possessed a strong, stable, and deeply rooted democratic tradition. Furthermore, the Social Democratic Labour Party was successfully navigating the Great Depression, offering a compelling, practical vision of a robust welfare state. In this environment, Quisling's party, with its abrasive, humorless leader, its foreign-looking ideology, and its thuggish street presence, was seen as politically toxic, an alien fringe element. New in the 1933 parliamentary elections, the Nationalsamling received a paltry 2.2% of the vote. By 1936, this support had collapsed further to just 1.8%. They failed, humiliatingly, to gain a single seat in the Norwegian parliament before the war. This repeated public rejection by the very people he claimed to be saving was a critical, festering blow to his colossal ego. Politically irrelevant, a national laughingstock, Quisling's ambition, far from diminishing, metastasized. It turned its gaze outward, seeking a more powerful, appreciative patron who would recognize his genius and his supposed destiny. A destiny the Norwegian people had foolishly rejected, politically bankrupt and marginalized in his own country. Vidkun Quisling's colossal ambition, intertwined with his messianic delusion, caused him to look toward the rising and ideologically aligned power to the south, National Socialist Germany. He was not a mere opportunist. He was a true believer, convinced that his failed party and Hitler's triumphant movement were fighting the same existential battle against Judeo-Bolshevism. He began actively cultivating connections with high-ranking German National Socialist officials, particularly those within the ideological and racial wings of the party. He found a receptive ear in Alfred Rosenberg, the National Socialists' archideologue, and in the German Navy, notably Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, who was growing increasingly concerned about British naval access to Norwegian waters and shipping routes. Quisling believed he was destined to lead Norway in a new, pan-Germanic Nordic order, and he saw Hitler as the key who would realize this destiny, a fellow visionary in a world of decadence. He presented himself to his German contacts, not as the leader of a failed fringe party, but as the spokesman for a powerful, underground movement in Norway, a gross exaggeration of his minuscule following. His new goal was no longer to win an election, a process he now despised as democratic theater. His goal was to be installed by a superior power. This desperate search for patronage culminated in the most treasonous meetings of his life. In December 1939, Just months after the outbreak of World War II, Quisling, with the help of Raeder and Rosenberg, secured the audience he had dreamed of. Met Adolf Hitler personally in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, not once but twice. In these meetings, Quisling, the former general staff officer of a neutral nation, argued passionately for a German preemptive occupation of his own country. He warned Hitler of a fabricated and imminent British plot to invade neutral Norway first, a lie designed to play on Hitler's strategic fears. He assured the Führer that his National Samling Party had significant support, and that the Norwegian people would welcome the Germans as liberators from their corrupt democratic government. He was, in effect, begging a foreign dictator to invade his homeland, offering it up on a silver platter, an act of almost unbelievable treachery. Returning to Norway from his fateful meetings with Hitler, Vidkun Quisling was no longer just a failed politician. He was an active agent of a foreign power, a willing and conscious fifth columnist, awaiting the signal to betray his homeland. He had crossed the Rubicon. He immediately began to operationalize his treason, transforming his small party apparatus into an intelligence network for the Third Reich. He and his small circle of co-conspirators, such as Albert Hagelin, became a direct conduit of information for their German contacts in Berlin. Quisling fed a steady stream of false and distorted intelligence to the National Socialists, reports meticulously designed to reinforce the narratives he had spun for the Führer. He wildly exaggerated British influence in Norway, painting the neutral Norwegian government as a secret cabal of British puppets, all to provoke and hasten the German invasion he so desperately wanted. More despicably, he used his extensive knowledge as a former high-ranking officer and a former Minister of Defense to systematically undermine his own nation's security. He provided the Germans with critical, classified details about Norwegian coastal defenses, the locations of fortifications, the numbers of guns, and their states of readiness. He detailed Norwegian mobilization plans, highlighting their weaknesses and the critical junctures that could be exploited. He gave character assessments of senior Norwegian commanders, identifying who might fight and who might fold under pressure. He assured his German handlers that a swift, decisive German strike would be met with support from his followers, or at the very least, with paralyzing confusion and minimal resistance, which his own government would then step in to manage. He was actively and methodically working to ensure that when the attack came, his own country would be as unprepared and vulnerable as possible. He was, in effect, helping to draw up the blueprint for the violation of his own nation's sovereignty, all in the delusional belief that from the smoking ruins he would be handed the reins of power as a long-awaited national savior. In the tranquil pre-dawn hours of April 9, 1940, the attack that Quisling had helped engineer and pleaded for was unleashed. Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway, began. German warships, violating Norway's neutrality, steamed into key forts Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik, while paratroopers targeted crucial airfields. A neutral, peaceful nation that had not seen war in over 126 years was thrown into a state of profound shock and chaos. The government, which had desperately clung to neutrality, was caught completely unprepared for the speed and brutality of the Blitzkrieg. As German forces pushed into Oslo, the royal family King Haakon VII and the legitimate government of Prime Minister Nygaardsvold were forced to flee the capital, beginning a desperate 2-month fighting retreat as they were hunted by air and land moving ever northward. The Norwegian people awoke to the sight of foreign troops marching in their streets, the sound of air raid sirens, and the paralyzing realization that they had been betrayed, not just from without, but from within. While the initial resistance was disorganized, it was also spontaneously heroic, exemplified by the dramatic sinking of the new German heavy cruiser Blücher in the narrow dryback narrows of the Oslofjord. Outdated shore batteries at Oscarsborg Fortress opened fire at point-blank range, sinking the flagship of the invasion fleet with its hundreds of troops and Gestapo administrators. This single, defiant act delayed the capture of Oslo just long enough for the king and government to escape, thereby preserving the legitimacy of the Norwegian resistance and denying the Germans their primary political objective. But in this moment of supreme national crisis, as his countrymen were dying to repel an invader, Vidkun Quisling saw not a tragedy, but his long-awaited divinely ordained opportunity. On the afternoon of that same chaotic day, April 9th, with the king and government fleeing for their lives and German troops still securing the capital, Vidkun Quisling seized his moment. Believing his hour of destiny had finally arrived, he made one of the most audacious and infamous moves in modern history. He gathered his small band of followers and stormed the studios of the Norsk Rikskringkasting NRK, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, in Oslo. Aided by German agents who secured the building, he muscled his way to the main microphone and at 7:52 p.m. went on the air to address a stunned and terrified nation. In a flat metallic voice, he announced a coup d'etat. He declared that the legitimate government of Johan Nygaardsvold, which he falsely accused of fleeing and abdicating its duties, was no longer in power. Therefore he, Vidkun Quisling, as the leader of the National Samling, was taking over as the new prime minister and head of a new national government. Most treasonously, he concluded his broadcast by ordering all Norwegian military mobilization to cease immediately and for all Norwegians to stop resisting the German invaders, whom he presented as protectors who had come to secure the country. It was an act of unparalleled treachery, broadcast live to the nation. It was the first time in history that a citizen of an invaded country had used the chaos of the invasion itself to declare himself ruler and, as his first act, order a complete surrender to the enemy. This radio broadcast was his crowning act of treason, the single moment that would forever seal his name in international infamy. The immediate reaction to Quisling's broadcasted coup was not the popular support he had expected, but universal and instantaneous outrage. The people of Norway, reeling from the shock of the invasion, were now confronted with this act of breathtaking treachery from within. Far from calming the situation, his declaration galvanized resistance and stiffened the resolve of the fleeing government. King Håkon VII, meeting with his government, was presented with a German demand, engineered by Quisling's allies, to formally appoint Quisling as prime minister. The king's response, delivered in what became known as the King's No, was a flat and total refusal. He stated he would rather abdicate the throne than recognize the traitor's government, a powerful symbolic act that unified the nation's legitimate resistance. But the rejection was not just from his own people. Even the Germans were furious. Quisling's arrogant, unilateral presumption of power had been a spectacular miscalculation. The Germans had been hoping for a more subtle, pseudo-legal transition, perhaps by strong-arming the king or the existing parliament into compliance, creating a legal fig leaf. Quisling's clumsy, self-aggrandizing coup had shattered this illusion, inflamed Norwegian resistance, and made a mockery of the German claim that they were there to protect Norway. His government, which lasted only 6 days, was a phantom, recognized by no one. Less than a week after his triumphant broadcast, his German masters, seeing he was not just useless but counterproductive, unceremoniously forced him to step aside. They established their own administration, the Reichskommissariat, Norwegian, under the absolute control of the brutal Joseph Turbovan, leaving Quisling a humiliated and powerless figurehead, a fool in the eyes of all. For 2 long years, Vidkun Quisling was relegated to the shadows, a political pariah, despised by his countrymen and ignored by his German masters. The real, absolute power in occupied Norway was wielded by Reichskommissar Joseph Turboven, fanatical National Socialist who ruled with an iron fist. Turbovan's regime was one of terror, systematic plunder, and brutal suppression. He crushed dissent, declared martial law, and executed hostages, treating Norway as his personal fiefdom. Quisling, however, remained a patient and loyal puppet, serving in a titular role and slowly rebuilding his National Samling party as the only legal political party in the country. Its ranks swelled with opportunists, ideologues, social climbers, seeking to profit from the occupation, creating a new collaborationist class. Finally, in 1942, the Germans decided he was useful again. Turbovan, needing a Norwegian face for his increasingly brutal occupation and to assist in the recruitment of Norwegian volunteers for the SS, decided to give Quisling the title he had so long coveted. On February 1, 1942, in a grandiose ceremony at Akershus Fortress in Oslo, Vidkun Quisling was appointed minister-president of a national government. This was his reward for 2 years of servility. He was finally the prime minister of Norway. but it was a hollow, grotesque victory. He was the head of a puppet regime, a Gauleiter in Norwegian dress, a man who held a title but no real power. He was utterly dependent on German bayonets for his authority, and all decisions of consequence still rested with Reichskommissar Turbo von. He was despised by all, a figure of universal contempt. The fur of a phantom state whose sole, ignominious purpose was to serve the interests of its foreign occupiers and to wage war against its own people. Quisling's regime was not just a collaborationist puppet, it was an active and willing participant in the most monstrous crime of the 20th century, the Holocaust. His government, eager to prove its ideological purity and usefulness to its Berlin masters, moved swiftly and methodically against Norway's small Jewish population. The Nationalsamling, already steeped in anti-Semitism, passed its own laws to register, dispossess, and segregate Norwegian Jews, mirroring the Nuremberg laws. His puppet government passed legislation to seize all Jewish property, businesses, and assets, effectively pauperizing the community overnight. The Norwegian state police, now controlled by the Nationalsamling, along with volunteers from the Herden paramilitary, became the primary tools for implementing the final solution in Norway. They were the ones who, in a series of brutal roundups in the autumn of 1942, arrested Jewish men, women, and children, dragging them from their homes. The most infamous of these actions was the deportation of 532 Jews on the SS Donau on November 26, 1942. A ship bound for Stettin, from where the victims were transported by cattle car directly to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. In total, Quisling's government and its police force assisted in the arrest and deportation of over 700 Norwegian Jews. Almost all of them were murdered. This was not a policy forced upon a reluctant regime. It was a crime embraced and enabled, and executed by Vidkun Quisling and his followers, a permanent and unforgivable stain on his name, an act that forever defined the malevolent anti-Semitic nature of his puppet rule and power. The Quisling regime and its Nationalsamling party embarked on a futile and deeply resented campaign to fundamentally emulsify every aspect of Norwegian society, believing in their own ideological righteousness. They attempted to impose their corporate fascist vision on a population that universally hated them. This was not just a political takeover. It was an attempted cultural and spiritual conquest. They tried to seize control of the education system, forcing all teachers to join a new National Socialist-controlled teachers' union and to indoctrinate children with NS ideology. This led to the lure-ridden the teachers' strike, where over 12,000 of Norway's 14,000 teachers risked their livelihoods and lives by refusing. Hundreds were arrested and sent to concentration camps in the freezing north, but their resistance never broke, and the regime was ultimately forced to back down in a humiliating public defeat. A similar battle occurred with the Kirkestriden, the church strike. As the clergy of the Church of Norway, Quisling's own father's institution, refused to become tools of the state, resulting in mass resignations and the creation of an underground church, even sports became a battlefield. The regime tried to Nazify all athletic organizations, leading to a massive nationwide boycott where all organized sporting events ceased, as athletes refused to compete for traitors. Regime organizing their own secret matches in forests instead. This massive, unified, and courageous civil resistance, from schools to churches to sports fields, demonstrated the universal loathing the Norwegian people had for the man who had sold out his country, turning his puppet state into a hollow shell, ruling over a people who opposed him at every turn, showcasing the power of non-violent mass resistance. As the tide of the war turned decisively against Germany, the foundations of Quisling's puppet state began to crumble. By 1944 and early 1945, with the Red Army advancing from the east and the Allies having landed in Normandy, the defeat of National Socialism was no longer a question of if, but when. For Quisling, however, reality remained a flexible concept. He was trapped in a bubble of his own deluded self-importance, holding on to a fanatical belief that he and his vision for a Nordic Norway would somehow survive the coming JDR Mirong. While his German masters prepared for a bitter, scorched earth defense of festing Norwegian fortress Norway, Quisling held desperate, rambling speeches to his dwindling followers promising a final, apocalyptic battle against the returning Bolshevik and Jewish threat. He held bizarre delusions of a peaceful, negotiated transition, imagining that the Allies would somehow recognize him as the only bulwark against communism and allow him to retain power. His delusional state was so profound that it shocked even his closest remaining allies. His puppet state disintegrated around him as officials and party members, sensing the end, began to panic, burn documents, or attempt to flee to Sweden. But Quisling himself, the ultimate puppet, remained in his residence, a man playing the role of leader in a play that had long since ended, completely isolated from the truth and awaiting the final curtain in a state of near total denial, a man completely divorced from the catastrophic reality he had helped create. The legal purge that followed, the Rettsoppdraget, was a period of intense national catharsis, a desperate and immediate need to cleanse the nation of the poison of collaboration and treason after 5 long years of occupation. The end for Quisling himself had come swiftly and ignominiously. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the occupation was over. The following day, May 9th, Vidkun Quisling was arrested without a fight at his residence, Villa Gimmel, on the Bygde Peninsula in Oslo. Quisling's trial was the centerpiece of this entire legal purge. He was put on trial for a litany of crimes, including high treason for his 1940 coup, his role in actively undermining the nation's defense, his complicity in the Holocaust through the murder of Norwegian Jews, and the illegal execution of Norwegian patriots. His defense was as pathetic as it was arrogant. He showed no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of his actions. Instead, he argued that he had acted to protect Norway from a worse fate, that his government had saved the country from being fully annexed by Germany or its old boogeyman from a Bolshevik takeover. He presented himself as a misunderstood savior, a selfless martyr who had sacrificed his own reputation for the good of his people. The court and the nation saw it differently. They saw a man whose staggering ego and fanatical ideology had led him to betray his king, his people, and his country at its moment of greatest peril. A man who had failed every test of leadership, patriotism, and basic human loyalty, sealing his own fate through his arrogance. Found guilty on almost all counts, Vidkun Quisling was sentenced to death. The legal basis for this was firm. The Norwegian government in exile in London had reinstated the death penalty specifically for treason and war crimes, anticipating the overwhelming need to hold collaborators like him to account. In the cold, early hours of October 24, 1945, at Akershus Fortress, the same historic bastion where he had been so grandiosely appointed minister-president, Quisling was brought before a firing squad. His final words, defiant and deluded to the very end, were reported as unjustly convicted. "I die innocent." He was executed. His body was later cremated, his ashes scattered in an unmarked grave to prevent his resting place from ever becoming a shrine. He died, but his name would live on in a way he could never have imagined. Even before the war was over, his name had entered the global lexicon as the ultimate byword for a traitor. Coined by the Times of London in 1940, Quisling became an epithet used worldwide to describe a specific and despicable type of betrayer. Not merely a traitor, but a citizen who actively collaborates with a foreign, occupying enemy to rule over their own subjugated people. This dark semantic legacy is his true, eternal punishment. He achieved the infamy he craved, but not as the savior of Norway he imagined, but as the permanent, universally recognized dictionary definition of treason itself, a truly ignominious end to a life of supposed brilliance. The trial was swift. The legal purge that followed was swift. Quisling was put on trial, charged with high treason, murder, and his role in the Holocaust. His defense was weak, claiming he acted to protect Norway from a worse fate, found guilty on almost all counts. Vidkun Quisling was executed by firing squad on October 24, 1945. He died. But his name would live on, entering dictionaries worldwide as the ultimate synonym for a traitor.